Study. We are a day late with this Bible study, but here, at least where we are in Florida, there is now electricity and broadband connection, and so we're grateful to be with you for another day. But obviously, our prayers and thoughts go out to all of those who still are struggling under the difficulties brought on by Hurricane Ian. So may God bless them, and may God enable all of us to do our part in helping carry the load of our brothers and sisters who are still struggling this morning. If you would like to be a part of this Bible study, we would love to have you along for the journey. We're right here every day, Lord willing, and a hurricane doesn't show up, Mondays through Thursdays, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. We're about halfway through the study, but you can jump in at any point. It's self-contained each and every day, and we'll keep you up to speed on what's going on, and you can get all of the details on the reading schedule and the plan and how you can be a part by visiting that URL right there, go.christtable.today/reconstruct. Today, we find ourselves in Nehemiah chapter 7, verses 1 through 6. We're now having crossed over the midpoint of the book of Nehemiah, are now kind of heading down the backside, but there is still a lot to talk about, to learn, and to digest about this journey through the reconstruction of the wall. That, as we've said, is what the book of Nehemiah is well known for, the construction of this wall around the temple and around the city of Jerusalem, perhaps as well, right after they had returned from captivity in Babylonia and then Persia. But what we've said is that God does not seem to be a fan of them rebuilding this wall, at least for the reasons that they were building it, and that is to keep people out. And so our contention here is that the book of Nehemiah is a cautionary tale of not what to do, but what not to do. So as we come now to chapter 7, verse 1, the wall seems to be finished. Now, it just has to be maintained, protected, and utilized. After the wall was finished, and I had set up the doors and the gates, the gatekeepers, the singers, and the Levites were appointed. Now, this brings us to a couple of very interesting questions, which we are not fully clear on, and I want to just kind of spend a moment or two to talk through that. The fact that we've learned that Nehemiah is governor means that it's not out of line necessarily for him to be managing the staffing of all of the things that are related to the city. The difficulty here is that this wall, there is some contention as to whether or not this wall was built around the temple or whether or not this wall was built around the city. If the wall was built around the city, that it seems as though Nehemiah, as governor, would have been appointing all of the people who were to staff and care for the wall. If it were around the temple, then it would have been the priest's responsibility in order to staff and maintain all of the people around the wall. So what we see here is a bit of an odd mix where Nehemiah seems to be the one doing the appointing, but the people who are staffing it are temple people. Singers and Levites and gatekeepers were also usually temple staff. So what we have here is a bit of a question mark as to whether or not it's a wall around the city or a wall just around the temple, but that actually ends up kind of reinforcing our idea that Nehemiah was doing a wall building for religious reasons, not just for safety and security reasons. So this is a huge flag for us that our thesis up until now, our claim has been correct, that Nehemiah is building a wall to keep people away from the temple, not to protect the city. And so if the wall is built in order to keep people away from the temple, then we have a direct offense to what God has said, and that is that his goal after the captivity, Isaiah 2, etc., 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 was for all people to be able to come to this temple and worship. What do walls do? Well, they keep people out, right? So I gave the responsibility of governing Jerusalem to my brother Hanani, along with Hananiah, the commander of the fortress, for he was a faithful man who feared God the most. Now, another interpretive challenge here. It feels as though all we have today are interpretive challenges here, but let's just kind of look at them directly. This may well be the same person, Hanani and then Hananiah. The names are so close in Hebrew that it may well be that these are the same individual, but it also may well be that they are two separate individuals. Either way, what we have here is Nehemiah choosing people who are well trusted to this job. A faithful man who feared God more than most, which means that this individual is going to do things that Nehemiah would have to be done. Does that make sense? Because Nehemiah has continued over and again to leverage how important this wall is to God, even though there's a question mark as to whether or not that was the case. But he has continued to leverage the wall as being there on God's command. And so if he puts somebody in charge who fears God the most, and Nehemiah, rather than the priest, Nehemiah is the one who is speaking on behalf of God, well, then this individual is going to want to listen to God's voice. And if Nehemiah is saying God's voice is coming through me, this individual is going to be tied to Nehemiah. We see this happen in religious contexts and faith communities and churches even today. The person who wields what God wants done, the power of God's voice, is able to control at any level what those people who are solely devoted to God's voice will do. So if people are put in positions of leadership, of responsibility, of management, who are solely committed to God's voice and they fear God and are dedicated to him, then the person who is perceived as being able to interpret or hear best and speak on behalf of that voice is, in a sense, going to be God. This seems to be what perhaps is going on here. Nehemiah is using God in order to motivate and, in a sense, control the people. And this individual is going to be very pliable, malleable to that kind of rhetoric. We also see that he appoints his brother. Nepotism is often a thing. Was his brother the best person to be there in leadership governing Jerusalem? Maybe. We don't really know much of anything about his brother except the last time that we saw his brother. He was coming to Nehemiah to implore him, to impose upon him, to get involved in the rebuilding of the wall. So it may well be that his brother Hanani was a noble, was a respected person, was somebody with influence or with power. But either way, what we see here is Nehemiah putting in one or two individuals who are going to be very beholden to him and what he wants done. This is a classic U.S. American management leadership circle the wagon of responsibility and control and power play. Maybe it didn't begin here in U.S. America. So verse 3, Nehemiah says to them, do not leave the gates open during the hottest part of the day, and even while the gatekeepers are on duty, have them shut and bar the doors. There's some contention here as to whether or not what we have in English is truly what's said in Hebrew. There's some question in the prepositions as to what they actually mean in the way that they're written. Were the doors supposed to be barred and closed during the hottest part of the day, or open during the hottest part of the day? Here you can see that this version of the text has gone with don't leave the gates open during the hottest part of the day. Some English versions will say do leave them open during the hottest part of the day. It's difficult to know which are which, but what we can ascertain from this is that Nehemiah has some very specific commands as to when people should be allowed access to the temple and when they should not be allowed access to the temple. And then appoint the residents of Jerusalem to act as guards, everyone on a regular watch. And so here is, I think, an interesting moment where the people of the city, who probably thought that their guard watches and their involvement with the wall would end when it was finished being constructed, are now learning that they now have two jobs. They have the job that brings in the money, that pays the bills, that provides for their family. And now they have this second job. They have been conscripted into volunteer work on guard duty because of their living in the city of Jerusalem. Everyone on a regular watch. Some will serve at entry posts and some in front of their own homes. What we see here is that the story is going to continue, which, if this were just a wall that was just built for safety and security of the city, the story at this point would be over. They have accomplished their job. But because of the fact that the story is going to continue, this is another indication to us that there is a much deeper lesson to be learned here. And there is a lot of things that are unsaid about the reasoning for this wall that are going to begin to become apparent as we press forward into this story, which we will continue next week on day 17. And I look forward to seeing you here Monday, 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time. And until that time, happy reading.